TellyCast, the TV industry news review.
Hi, I'm Justin Crosby, and welcome to this week's TellyCast. Before we start this week's show, just a quick word to let you know we're now taking bookings for a unique new series of bespoke MIPCOM Slate podcasts, specially designed for content owners and distributors looking to give their full catalogue marketing a new dimension. We'll produce these premium shows for you to create an entertaining and engaging sales tool that can include show clips along with producer, talent and distributor interviews. Episodes will feature on all major podcast platforms, plus you can embed the show in your own website and use as a sales tool alongside your digital marketing assets and mailings. We also have regular show sponsorship packages still available for September. October is now booked. So, if you're interested in hearing more, please email me on justin@boomdialogue.com. That's justin@boomdialogue.com for the rate card and for more info. You can also find that email address in this week's episode description. So, on to this week's show, and my guests are Woodcut Media's Creative Director, Derren Lawford, and Drive's Joint Managing Director, Ben Barrett. Peter White from Deadline joins us with news of the axe falling on some big-name executives in the US TV business. And K7 Media's TV soothsayer, Girts Licis, looks at content with a purpose. It's all coming up on this week's TellyCast. So, welcome to the show, Derren and Ben.
Hello.
Good morning, Justin. Thanks for having us.
Derren, let's start with you. Woodcut, you're renowned as one of the leading UK factual indies, doing business on an international level as well as domestically. How's the pandemic affected you guys over there?
I think with everyone, it's a case of what were you doing when the music stopped? And that determined how you were going to get through this period. And we were relatively fortunate in so much as most of our productions were in production and nearing the edit or in the edit. And that most of the shows that had international filming had been done, or we were ramping up how it is that we were going to be filming in those spaces. So in February, we were talking about how we were going to film in America differently. And so we just changed how we were going to do it and sort of use more local crews and that kind of thing, to the point that we had one person in LA, British person, member of the team, who was able to get back into the UK just as lockdown was about to happen in America. But it was timed pretty much perfectly, fortunately for us, because we've just been thinking a bit earlier about the international footprint, because a lot of our shows are either co-financed or distributed to sort of America and Western Europe, and we were always looking for those sort of editorial elements. So on that side of things, we were okay with a bit of forward planning. We've got our own in-house post-production, and we'd begun to move those to a remote system rather than everyone being in the office, which also meant that we were still able to deliver the shows. So during lockdown, we were delivering shows, Tony Robinson's VE Day to Discovery, Secret History World War II to Channel 5, Combat Ship Series 3 to Smithsonian, and Secret History World War II to Histoire in France as well. That helped in two ways, we think. A, we were able to still give people the shows that they were hoping to receive and still be in production. But it also gave channels confidence in us to be able to still work during this period, so that when you're pitching ideas, they also have a sense that these are ideas that you could deliver because you haven't stopped delivering during this period. It just gave us a good news story to be able to tell about the company during this time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It seems to me that the companies that have an international footprint or international capability and relationships have been the ones that have tended to cope better through this.
When we look at international business, and ideas, it's a collaborative conversation with lots of different parties. So we're quite used to having conversations about packaging programs financially with lots of different parties. If you've had a domestic business in whatever country, whether it's just in the UK or just in the US or just in Germany, and you're only dependent on the domestic market, then you are a hostage to whatever is challenging that domestic market. So say you, as a producer, you were only really focusing on Channel 4 and BBC. It would be a challenging time. BBC's needs are changing as in relation to the audience they're trying to appeal to during a pandemic, and obviously Channel 4 is challenged by a downturn in advertising revenue. As a producer, you've got no control over those two things. You can't control the audience's desire for more news and current affairs at this time, and you can't control the advertising market. Whereas if you're an international producer, what you can control is, I've got X amount of money in my pocket and I need to find someone else to put X amount in. That hasn't changed for us in many ways.
Yeah, there are lots of companies, I think, internationally, particularly younger companies, that have been focusing on that domestic market. And, let's just hope that the new insurance fund that was announced in the last 10 days will help them get back to some form of normality. How about catalogue for Woodcut? Have you had success repackaging catalogue? Has that been a major part of the side of things you've done during the lockdown?
It was definitely something that we had a think about right at the start. None of us knew how long this was going to be for, and none of us still know. But in those first sort of couple of weeks, there was definitely a lot of talk in the factual space about archive-driven shows, whether it's your own archive or existing archive that's out there, and how you might package that and curate that. So we definitely had conversations with people about that. We have explored developing shows that are sort of predicated on maybe a mixture of our archive and other people's archive. But we quickly realized that there's only a finite amount of stories that you can tell through archive, and there's only a finite amount of people that can make those stories. And so that doesn't really give us a point of distinction in the marketplace. And now more than ever, you need to be able to do that. After those first sort of 2 to 3 weeks, we haven't overly focused on catalogue-driven shows. We've focused on what are the shows that we can make during this time that people associate us with, and where are those people around the world that can help us make that happen.
You mentioned a few shows that are essentially established franchises now, which is also a real bonus. In terms of new shows and new developments and getting new ideas away right now, I mean, presumably the emergency COVID insurance fund that we talked about a bit earlier has now come into being. Is that going to help? Is it going to help significantly?
I think it helps breathe confidence into the market on both sides. So if you're a producer, you feel confident to go out and shoot because you feel like you've got that security. And conversely, if you're a broadcaster, you feel confident about investing in new shows because you feel like if there's a chance that they can be delivered, and if anything does happen, then there is some sort of coverage. But I guess from a broadcaster's point of view, you've still got to get all the shows that you paused back online. And so there's still going to be a backlog in terms of decision making for brand new shows, I think. It's not that brand new shows won't get commissioned, because they are, but I think if it's a completely new show, which is really bold and innovative, I still don't feel like anyone is rushing to fund that type of show. But if it's a show that could be made good quality, that builds on stuff that you might have done before, you feel like there's more of a chance of that show being made.
It's about low risk, isn't it?
Yeah,
and lowering the risk and hopefully raising the reward, if you like. Are you in production right now? Are you producing anywhere?
Yes, and I'm just trying to work out what I can and can't say. Yes, we are. So what I can say is that we are producing series, plural, but the one I can mention is Murder at My Door with Kim Marsh. Yeah, we've been filming contributors. We've shot with Kim. We're delivering episodes at the moment. And there are other shows that we are currently in production on as well.
What's this whole situation taught you about working in TV?
Particularly in the UK, like it's a business that's predicated on relationships. I can't remember who said it before, but I kind of think there's some truth in it, is that people tend to commission people as opposed to programs and ideas. Yeah. And it's like how they know those people. And I think, like, if you've got good relationships with people and you've been able to make those connections, then you are, I guess, building on those connections in a virtual sense. But if you're trying to build new connections, it's very difficult to do that now. You know, there isn't a serendipitous encounter with someone in a bar, at an event. You know, it's like you can have a virtual networking event, but it's difficult to have those bonds and create those new bonds and those new relationships. That's the bit that's challenging, I think.
Yeah.
But conversely, I do think that the people that you have relationships with, that you have good relationships with, those feel stronger, because ultimately we're all in this together now more so than ever. So that's one bit.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I think is that, you know, we've got offices in Hampshire and London. And so we'd always been advocates of remote and flexible working. But I don't think that we have done it as well as we've done it now. If I just think back 6-7 months ago, if 4 or 5 of us were going to have a conversation, we'd all jump on a conference call. You know, people would be talking over one another. It was never really satisfactory, but we always did it. I can't remember anyone ever saying, why don't we jump on a video call? Why don't we jump on a Zoom? And now it's the other way around. Now it's odd if you jump on the phone with more than 2 or 3 people, and now it's natural to be in vision with people. And I think that in and of itself has also meant that you also think about being more international. Like, it's never been easier to be more international in many ways.
Yeah.
You know, you just send someone a link and I can be having a conversation with someone in Germany, France, and America, and probably a little bit more than I had been doing before. That's definitely been something that I've noticed from our perspective.
Yeah, and I think people have been a little bit more available, haven't they? Because I think,
yes,
you know, we've all been working from home. There's been less people traveling, less people in conferences, less people doing a lot of possibly internal business, especially in bigger companies. Ben, coming to you. Thanks for coming on the show. Drive, obviously involved in distribution as well as co-production financing. Let's take factual content acquisition, which is one of your specialist area. First of all, have you seen trends developing in the last 6 months?
Well, I mean, it's certainly been interesting. And I think that it's been really particularly interesting being inside the distribution world and hearing the way that a lot of people have talked about the trends and what they've assumed is happening. And as Derren said, when COVID first started, there was this sort of mad rush for producers and people like ourselves who are often involved in packaging projects and putting together funding, working very closely with producers to kind of come up with new slates of ideas that could be produced during the pandemic. And also there was a real slew of people developing shows specifically about the virus. And I think what we saw quite quickly is that actually, other than some very early activity on COVID-related commissions, I think a lot of broadcasters decided very quickly that they didn't want to buy those type of shows, because I think they thought coming out of the pandemic, that's the last thing people are going to want to watch. But I also think that actually, you know, in terms of the way that the buying patterns have evolved, is we saw almost all broadcasters massively engaging immediately with conversations about what have you got, what's actually produced, what's in edit so it can definitively be delivered, or what isn't, you know, what would still need production, and what have you got like sitting in the catalogue right now. Obviously, it was a different situation for different channels and different types of broadcaster. Obviously, the SVODs, I think, you know, have obviously weathered the storm particularly well, and some of the commercial channels have obviously struggled. But essentially, what we found is there was a huge amount of talk about, oh, as a distributor, you must be selling tons of shows in those early months of sort of, you know, March, April, May. And actually, what we were doing is we were talking more than I think we've ever talked to people about buying shows, while sales actually stayed pretty steady, as you know, as per they had from the previous months, and as we were to forecast for the year. We didn't see that huge surge until actually much more recently. I think that lots of broadcasters, of course, have programming in reserve. You know, they always schedule several months in advance. They've always got commissioned content sitting on the shelf. There was a huge amount of talk and actually not a lot of action for a while beyond normal course of business. But having said that, in the last few weeks, it's kind of gone crazy. And this is absolutely the busiest August I've ever experienced in TV land. We've really seen buyers come to the fore from sort of the middle of July. Literally when you would normally expect it to start really getting quiet, we've really seen an uptick in acquisitions activity. And I think that's because maybe that we're now 3-4 months in and those gaps are now much clearer. Also, people are beginning to see an end in sight and so are making more structured planning. And for us, very, very busy at the moment, but a lot of the early months were really more conversations than action.
August, as you say, is usually the time the TV industry is traditionally dead, really, isn't it? It'll be interesting to see how that moves into the traditional MIPCOM cycle when everybody gets back from holiday in September, everyone's back at the desks, hopefully kids are back at school, and a certain amount of normal service might be getting a bit closer to being resumed. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes over the next few weeks. I mean, in terms of Drive, you're renowned as probably the leading co-production financing business in Factual. How do you think this side of the industry is going to be affected? I mean, do you see that co-productions is over the last few years, it's clearly come to the fore as a really important way of producing new programming? Do you expect that to increase in importance going forward?
Yeah, I do. I mean, you're right. Obviously, in recent years, we've seen a significant sort of growth in whether you call it, co-pro pre-sales, enhanced pre-sales, all these different models that have become the norm now. We've seen it come, more and more to the everyday business activity, and not just for us. I mean, when we started Drive back in 2013, we were exclusively doing that. And I think we were one of two of the only people who were really focusing on that area. Now, most distributors are very involved in bringing in pre-sales or certainly aim to be very involved in bringing in pre-sales. I definitely think it's here to stay. I think that the biggest challenge that COVID has thrown up and the sort of continued sort of fragmentation of the market is the attitudes to risk, something that Derren touched on. I think that, broadcasters are more than ever are risk averse. And so when you are putting these multi-party projects together, it's never been more important that you have the right elements in place. So, you're still going to need a really good idea, and you're still going to need a really good production company to execute it. You're still going to need a strong lead broadcaster that gives confidence to other channels. You don't always need all of those things, but you tend to always need at least a couple of them. One thing that we've really felt in the last year, but certainly even more in the last few months, is having those key elements, which starts always with idea and producer, but then also partners, is a really key thing to getting things over the line, because I think the attitude to risk is just probably at an all-time low.
There's lots of consolidation going on, isn't there? I mean, obviously, Banijay and the Endemol Shine Group acquisition that went through a few weeks ago, and we expect to see, I would imagine, as we go through this turbulence, lots more mergers, acquisition activity happening. Presumably, now's a really good time to be a boutique, if you like, a boutique business offering a really different kind of sales partnership to producers, a niche area, if you like.
It's always a double-edged sword because, the big players have very deep pockets. They are able to come in with significant advances and first look deals and things that can take lots of good companies off the market, take lots of good shows off the market. We don't tend to get involved in sort of bidding wars for straight acquisition of content that is being put out to the market, because that's just not really our model. Our model is much more about collaboration with a small group of companies that we really work well with and we feel we can add value to. And I do, yeah. So I think on that, from that respect, it is a really good time to be doing what we're doing and being boutique, because it's those relationships that have become, they're the key to the success of our business. And also, we like to think that we're key to the businesses of our partners and in helping them to get shows away. And I think more and more producers are looking for that. More and more producers, companies like Woodcut obviously have a vast array of international relationships themselves. They do a lot of this themselves and they do it very well. But there are lots of other companies who are still aspiring to do that and are making steps in that area. And that's really our key USP is working with those companies to help them do that. And yeah, so and on that basis, it's a really good good time for us, yes.
So coming back to the buyers, how do you expect buyer behaviour to change over the next 6 months?
Gosh, well, I mean, that's a tricky one to answer. If we work on the assumption that we don't get a full, a proper second wave, in multiple territories, and that things slowly get back to normal between now and the end of the year, then I think that we'll see buying patterns reverting to fairly normal, insofar as you have to allow for the fact that lots of channels are going to be working on recovering from the loss of advertising revenues. So I think we're going to see a lot of downward pressure on price. I think, volume is going to be important for people. We've certainly found that series that we have where we have many hours or many series of a brand, those have been particularly interesting for buyers at the moment. And I think another thing that we as a distributor have to be really aware of is that while some production has managed to keep going during the pandemic, and we've been fortunate, we had 2 series that we didn't really have to stop because of the nature of how they were being produced. But a lot of production, have obviously ground complete to a standstill. That is going to have a big impact on the pipeline for next year. So I think that production can get back going properly in the next month or so. Then, we're looking at a 3 to 4 month gap, so you'd expect a sort of, 30 to 40% drop in the amount of hours that are going to be available on the market for sale for next year. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about the fact that, potentially this is a very good time for non-scripted, because the scripted shows are obviously in the big studio shows. Those are facing far more challenges of coming back to normality. So on one hand, I think we're going to see a lull in the amount of content available, without doubt. But I do think there will probably be increased demand for that content because of the gaps that will still be there because of the other types of shows that are not going to be coming through for a little while longer. So it's really hard to call, but I hope those two things sort of balance themselves out as much as possible.
So, Derren, coming to you with your story of the week, and you've chosen the BBC's N-word fiasco. Can you talk us through that?
First thing I wanted to say was, so June Sarpong, who's the Director of Creative Diversity, when they announced their £100 million diversity fund and the set of initiatives around that, she said something quite interesting. She said, I came to the BBC as an outsider. Before joining, I had an idea of this being an organisation that did not want to change. What I found was something different, an organisation that had ambitious goals for diversity and inclusion, but didn't know how to reach them. And the quote goes on, but that's a pretty good analysis of how the BBC has found itself in this position, where you had June's CDX Diversity Festival, which was incredibly inclusive, incredibly inspiring. And off the back of that, Farron becomes a senior black leader running One Extra. And at the same time, you have this N-word fiasco. And so the question is, how do those two things happen at the same time? Like, how is there all of this efforts to be doing this good, and at the same time, there's this thing that managed to alienate exactly the same people they're trying to embrace and empower? Marcus Ryder, who's done a lot of writing and talking about this kind of stuff, he made a really interesting point when I thought about how I could apply it to this situation, like in terms that lots of people could understand. And he basically said, there have been historically senior black and diverse people within the organisation, and there aren't as many now to be able to have those conversations. So if I think back to when I was at the BBC, so I started as a senior broadcast journalist, and then in terms of in the news and current affairs world, I rose to being a multi-platform editor for Panorama. I would sit in on, it was a self-commissioning strand, I would sit in on commissioning meetings. At the time, Tom Giles, who now runs ITV's current affairs and bits of their faculty output, was deputy editor, right? I was also, because I was doing a lot of digital stuff at Panorama, advising editorial policy about compliance issues around on-demand content. Right? This is 7-8 years ago. So Tom left, Tom became editor and then runs ITV Current Affairs over an 8-year period. So let's just imagine that I stayed in news and current affairs, and it's 8 years later, and I'm a senior editorial figure within news and current affairs. If that incident had occurred, it wouldn't have occurred in the same way. Here's what would have happened. There would have been a discussion about whether that word should have been used. And then I would have said, well, here's how that word makes me feel, okay? I grew up in Eltham in the early 80s, and from the age of 7 to 16, I would hear that word directed at me, guaranteed, every week. I just didn't know where or when. I didn't know whether it was going to get shouted out of a van that was driving past me. I didn't know whether it was going to get shouted at me when I was on a bus and someone was behind me. I didn't know whether it was going to be a newsagent saying it to me instead of my name. I didn't know whether it was going to be a security guard stopping me going into a shop. I didn't know whether I'd be going to a pub and then people would use it and then they go, oh, no, let's not use that word now because Derren's around. Okay, so like it's a word that causes serious offence and trauma. However, when you look at the BBC's editorial guidelines, it is not considered a word that requires a mandatory referral. When you realise that no racist slur requires a mandatory referral, it makes you wonder, why is that? Probably, I would argue, because there wasn't someone from a particular background, ethnic background, that says, has anyone ever realised that this is a glaring omission? There are 3 words that require a mandatory referral, and none of them are racial slurs. That is now changing as a direct result of what's happened. And so I think this is, big organisations have lots of different processes and lots of different people in rooms making decisions. And if you don't have the right complement of people in the rooms for really senior decisions, this is how mistakes like this can happen. Because someone's not in the room raising their hand up and going, excuse me, let's just take a moment, maybe think about doing this in a different way.
Yeah. And for those international listeners that may not have come across this news story, this was basically a regional news report on Points West, which was a BBC news show in the west of England. And it was a BBC social affairs correspondent repeated the N-word, which was the language allegedly shouted during an attack on a young black man in Bristol. And apparently the family involved actually wanted the word to be used during the report. And that's perhaps what has led to this. I mean...
So I get that bit. I get why they would want it to be used. This is where it really helps having people from different backgrounds in the room when you have the conversation about whether you do it or not. If there was a scenario where it could have been okay, then it would have needed to have been a black reporter. Because what is very difficult to understand if you're not black is how that word sounds when it comes out the mouth of a person who's white. It's just very difficult to understand because you haven't been on the other side of it. This is one of the things that I guess was beginning to undermine what it is they were doing or how they were going about it. There was a tweet from Larry Madowo who said, the BBC didn't allow me, an actual black man, to use the N-word in an article when quoting an African American who used it. But a white person was allowed to say on TV because it was editorially justified. Okay, and this is where the BBC got itself tied up in knots a little bit. Thankfully, they have come to their senses. It is a shame it took 2 weeks and thousands of people complaining and a one extra talent sideman having to resign in opposition to what at that point had been no acknowledgement that there should be an apology. And in a way, I think the broadcast, when there were 2 broadcasts, because there was a Lucy Worsley show as well, the broadcasts themselves were bad in terms of the reaction that people had towards them. But what exacerbated the situation was a refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing. And I think this is something that we're just seeing on a wider scale with sort of the reckoning around systemic racism at the moment, is that, there's this notion of white fragility, but there's also this is compounded by institutional fragility. The notion that you cannot, as an organization, accept wrongdoing because you're worried about something else in that conversation. And the listening and learning that they said that they want to do now, if that's the biggest lesson that they should take as an organization, it's if we are dealing with something that speaks to a lived experience that I have not had, then let me listen and learn from people who have. It's as simple as that. If they had done that, they just wouldn't be in this situation.
It is extraordinary. I mean, I think the BBC clearly, you mentioned earlier on, allocating £100 million inclusivity fund, appointing June Sarpong as creative diversity director. I mean, they're making all the right moves, I think, generally, but it just seems to still be fundamental disconnects in the organisation as it tries to do the right thing. I mean, do you think the corporation can learn from this experience?
I actually think that the whole industry can learn from this. And I think the whole industry is learning from it. There was Creative Skill Set webinar yesterday on diversity. You've got Danny Horan, Zai Bennett, Charlotte Moore, Kevin Ligo. The challenge for the industry is these are the most senior editorial figures in the land talking about diversity, and none of them are diverse. And obviously today, broadcast was announcing that, reporting on Kevin and Zai in particular, saying we are committed to making sure there are more senior Black, ethnic minority, diverse, underrepresented editorial figures, because that is the difference. Once you're in the room with different types of people and different perspectives, you are just less likely to come up with the wrong approach to people who you haven't lived through their experiences. But also, it's better for business, like ABC, one of the most, if you look at the success of ABC's content, like, it's predicated on having diverse casts, because they're like, if we have as many different people as possible in these shows, then as many different people as possible are going to want to subscribe and watch our shows. It's what Netflix do. Netflix are trying to be like a global broadcaster, which means they need everyone to watch, which means it's their business imperative to make shows for everyone all the time. And I think it's interesting when you look at a brand like Netflix. That's obviously they started from a different position, but their approach is pretty clear-headed. It's like, if you genuinely want to appeal to everyone, then you need as many different people as possible helping you make those really big calls.
Absolutely. Well, let's hope that the BBC and the wider industry, as you say, internationally can learn from this experience and perhaps take a leaf out of Netflix's book to really try and improve this situation going forward. Ben, your story of the week is, talking about Netflix, is the report on global OTT revenues, and OTT meaning all forms of over-the-top transmission, including SVOD, AVOD, direct downloads, etc. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
This is the report that came out from Digital TV Research and was reported, I think it was yesterday, in quite a lot of detail in various different publications. And what really stood out for me in reading this was just the sort of sheer scale of the growth, really. It's not surprising when we know how much of the dialogue and discourse of the industry at the moment is all about OTT. But when you strip it back and you look at the fact that, so the key numbers are that the global OTT revenues reached 83 billion in 2019. But that is an increase of 50 billion from 2017, meaning that's almost 300% growth over the last, in 2/3 years. Alongside that, you've seen AVOD, which we've all been pitching to Netflix and Amazon and various other SVOD services, which are really now beginning to grow. I mean, CuriosityStream is one that I'm particularly interested in. We're doing quite a bit of business with them, and they're doing some great stuff, and they've seen massive growth. And I think they've just announced that they're going to be floating, actually, doing an IPO. So we all know about the streamers and that sort of scale of growth, alongside the scale of growth in AVOD, which is also which accounted for 24 billion. So, over a third, just under a third of the OTT revenues in 2019. And AVOD's really particularly interesting for us as a distributor, because I say a factual distributor, because I think the AVOD market scripted has been much more developed for a number of years. But until last year, we were really doing very little in this space. We were being offered only revenue share deals, and when we dipped our toe in the water, the revenue was pretty minimal. And to be frank, we were doing deals with shows that we weren't selling to TV. AVOD now is, it just feels like it's really now part of the conversation for us as a distributor with every show that we take on. And, and again, I just really stress, working in documentaries and in factual, that's a big jump from where it was a couple of years ago. We're now seeing lots of different types of deals. We're seeing lots of flexibility on how we can work in different territories and different windowing with different rights. So that for me was particularly interesting. But I think the biggest thing about this report that stood out was actually once you asked me to be on the podcast, Justin, I was looking through the week's news and thinking, what's an interesting story that I could talk about? It was just that this just stood out as such a sort of big growth story alongside just numerous stories of difficulty and woe from within the TV side of the business, that it really just felt like a real sort of juxtaposition of how these two different sectors are going in different directions. Alongside that, those growth figures that have already, almost trebled in the last 3 years. Also in the news this week, new Disney Star streamer planned for 2021, Viacom SVOD planned for 2021, Curiosity Stream IPO, as I mentioned, Little Dot acquisitions, Pluto acquisitions. So, there's all this positive noise and activity happening in the OTT space. Meanwhile, your TV headlines are dominated by, mass redundancies and job losses at Warner's, subscription losses at Foxtel, ad revenue down for commercial channels. For me, it just stood out that, the OTT market is just, it's just going to be such a big part of our future. And particularly at the minute, it seems to be going from strength to strength with all these new things planned for next year and beyond, I'm sure. Whereas, TV's having, it's still the lion's share of what we do. And as with TV and OTT, it's still the major markets that, the top 5 markets that are really dominating the vast majority of the revenues. But it really stood out for me on the list of stories as something that was, quite stark in what it represented for the two different sectors.
In terms of the experience of selling shows to traditional TV businesses, linear TV businesses versus SVODs and AVOD channels, for example, what do they need to do to try and fight back, do you think? What does, on the buying side, what do networks need to do?
I guess the short answer is lots of them, this isn't so much the fight back, but, as I just said, with all the stories, all of the major networks are now just have got multiple OTT plans. There's more and more coming on that front. It's clear that content sharing between the different platforms only really works to a certain degree, and to be honest, doesn't often work that well at all. The standard terms that you'll get from the big OTTs that we've mentioned by name, that you'll get TV back after 12 or 18 months, by which point, unless you've got a massive hit show that's really found a big audience on OTT, not many channels are going to be that interested in it, in our experience. Perhaps the biggest thing is that we have found that OTT services are just much quicker in their decision making, and they're fairly uniform in deal structures. That for me is a major factor. But often they are global deals as well, and there's only certain projects that you really want to do a global deal for. I would still, for the right show, and we've done this several times in the last few years, we've turned down big global OTT offers to go territory by territory. And every time we've done it, it's worked for us. Now, we wouldn't always do that, because it might be that, those are particular event pieces or big specials or certain things where we knew there was going to be a big audience in a number of different markets. The big challenge for the linear channels is obviously these, is going to be, and for both really, is going to be this sort of the rights overlap and how the market is going to find its way through that, because the sharing of content between the two platforms, certainly in non-scripted, is something that, sort of seems to work sometimes on paper, but much less in practice.
Interesting. Well, no, it's a fascinating time, but the last 6 months seems to have supercharged that move towards streaming, and we're going to see a lot of these traditional networks fundamentally having to rethink how they operate, and unfortunately, that's probably going to mean a lot of job losses as well as we go through the winter. So now it's the time in the show that you've all been waiting for, to hear Derren and Ben's Hero of the Week and who or what they want to get in the bin. Derren, let's start with you. Who's your Hero of the Week?
Okay, so my Hero of the Week is Dominic Buchanan. So Dominic is one of the co-creators of End of the Effing World, hugely successful drama series, BAFTA award-winning series, and for reasons of sort of process and protocol, has not been allowed to have a BAFTA mask. It speaks to people having to speak truth to power whilst being discriminated against, which leads me to the thing that I would like to put in the bin. And I was trying to think, what is the thing that I want to put in the bin with all this different stuff swirling around? And it isn't like systemic racism, too big for the bin. It isn't white fragility, because that's not for me to put in the bin. But what it is, I think, is bureaucratic bungling is the only way. There's these outdated processes that are meaning which people are slightly hamstrung by. Because of that, they're compounding mistakes or making unnecessary mistakes rather than moving things forward. So yeah, a little bit of clear-headedness in terms of how processes could be updated for the benefit of everyone would be good.
Yeah. So bureaucratic bungling is going in your bin.
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. And just coming back on your Hero of the Week, it was extraordinary, that story, that the co-creator of this hit show couldn't have a mask. The iconic BAFTA trophy for creating such a huge hit show, and just due to I didn't really understand why he couldn't get it. It was just extraordinary to me.
Like it's a technicality, but there's the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, that old saying, and I think this is a very unfortunate case of that. And you have to bear in mind that for him to write an open letter like that, it takes a lot of courage, and it may come to nothing, and he still feels like he has to do that. That takes real courage. I think what's really interesting about it is that the show, it's a really good example. He's a talented black creative that created something that had mass appeal and wasn't about blackness. And as he said since, he's like, if people now come to me and say, if you're a black person, you want to try and do anything in the industry, is it possible? He feels like it's harder for him to say that. And that, for me, is the real shame out of it, is that this actually was an opportunity to be an amazing good news story. It was and it's like snatching defeat for the jaws of victory. Hence my bureaucratic bungling.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, well, we'll put a link to that news story in the description of the podcast, so everybody can kind of click on that and figure out, see if they can figure out why he couldn't get this award after working on this show for almost 10 years. Ben, coming to you, who or what is your Hero of the Week?
Well, I've taken the slightly unusual approach of sitting on the fence with one particular story and saying that this could be absolutely brilliant, or this could be something that really needs to get into the bin. So This is a story that I read in C21 about the US version of the Eurovision Song Contest, which is called the American Song, and it's due to debut in the holiday season of 2021. So This has been put together by a team from a company called the Brain Academy, part of Nordic Entertainment Group, and they are going to be working with a couple of very experienced Scandinavian producers whose names I can't pronounce, but have produced 20 Eurovision Song Contests between them. And they also apparently have Ben Silverman from Propagate on board in the US, but I note that they do not have a US channel as yet. Now we all love to laugh at the Eurovision Song Contest in the UK, and we know that lots of countries in Europe take it really very seriously, and see it as an absolute, must-win event for certain countries. But the idea of doing it in America, I think, is actually brilliant. You have such a diverse nation with so many rich types of incredible music. So the idea is they're going to do a different song for each one of the 50 states.
That's it. So it's by state.
Yeah, it's done by state. And I just think if it doesn't turn into the kind of show that we have here in Europe, it could actually become... It's actually a really brilliant idea, and I think something that could be fantastic. If it goes the way that it's perceived here, then perhaps it will be utterly unwatchable. And as I said, I do know they don't have a channel on board as yet, so I'll be very interested to see how that plays out. But that, for me, could be completely heroic, and it could be utterly terrible. And hopefully we'll find out next year.
So you're reserving judgment.
Yeah,
I think you'll be able to tell how it's going to go in the first 5 minutes of that show.
Absolutely.
And I just hope that Will Ferrell is involved in some way. Presumably doing, the Fire Saga opening song.
You know what? To get him as a host, like in a Graham Norton style role,
definitely.
That would be
he's a big fan, isn't he? The film actually is almost a love letter, isn't it, to Eurovision? It's done with such care and affection that it's funny as well. It's great. But let's hope they do keep some sort of humour in it, though, rather than just being sort of country versus rock or whatever. Let's hope it's
humour and some great music, and I think they'll be on to a real winner.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, fantastic, guys. Really appreciate you coming on the show in this very busy August. So thanks again for your time. Good luck. Really look forward to seeing you guys in the real world at some point very soon.
All right. Thanks, Justin.
All right.
That would be nice.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Justin.
Cheers. It's time to welcome once again Peter White from Deadline Hollywood. He's joining us from LA. How you doing, Peter?
Hey, Justin. I'm good. I'm back in the office for the first time since I took this job. I say back in the office, like this is the first time I've been in the office.
You moved to LA when? Was it March?
I moved on March 17th, just as President Donald Trump had put in a travel ban from the UK to the US. So we snuck in there, and it's been 5 months now. So it's nice to see the office.
Since the last time you were on TellyCast, so there's two things that have transpired. Number one, the Emmys, you predicted the Emmys was going to be an online-only event, which not a massive surprise, but it was announced. But there was also an earthquake.
I think we've had 3 earthquakes since I've been here. And I'll be honest, I haven't felt any of them. A little bit disappointed. I got a few texts a couple of weeks ago and saying, "Oh, did you feel that?" And I didn't see anything.
Did you? You slept through them, didn't you? You slept through them.
Slept through them. You get a good night's sleep out here, I'll tell you that.
So what's been going on in the LA TV business?
It's been a big week for corporate bloodletting in Hollywood. But restructuring has been going on. Warner Media and NBC Universal, big changes at both of those. Not really COVID related. I think this is more structural than that. I think this problems that came about when streaming essentially became the be all and end all, it seems. So on the Warner side, a couple of big names got let go or announced on Friday that they were leaving. Bob Greenblatt, who is the chairman of Warner Media Entertainment and direct-to-consumer, and Kevin Riley, who was chief content officer for HBO Max and a bunch of the cable networks like TNT and TBS. So they're both leaving. They've been replaced by Anne Starnhoff, who is taking over. She's the Warner Brothers chief. So she's going to see all of the network's film and TV studio, as well as the streaming assets. And then a bit of a promotion for the HBO boss, Casey Bloys, who was president of HBO programming. And he now will oversee HBO Max and some of those other networks. So a big move there. On the international side, some of the listeners might know Jeffrey Schlesinger. So he's going. He's probably best known as the man who once rode into an LA screenings party on an elephant.
Yes, I've heard about this.
Yeah, it was many moons ago. It was probably 10 years ago now. He was wearing a translucent suit as well, which often gets forgotten. But they had a big party, and he waltzed in on the back of an elephant. So I don't know if he's going to be leaving on the back of an elephant, but yeah, he's certainly out. And that sort of points to, the change of the way the business is being done. It's less about selling shows. It's streaming. It's global rights. It's all those sorts of things. So, and it's content. Casey is you can see why he's got the promotion, because HBO has been on a bit of a tear recently.
Yeah.
So there's that, and I'm sure there'll be some more big names over the next few days and weeks. We're rooting around to see who else is going.
Yeah, these are really big names, aren't they? I mean, at the top of the company. I mean, is there any idea of sort of middle management and what the overall cull looks like? Is it just in LA or is it worldwide?
Well, it'll be global, but so we're hearing numbers between 600 and 800. A lot of those people will be in sort of operations, finance, and some of those divisions. There will be a lot of crossover because they're essentially bringing a lot of different units together, so that there'll be a lot of duplication of roles. So there won't be too many more very high-profile names. I think those are the big ones, but I'm sure there'll be a few. And yeah, we don't know how it's going to play out. Certainly in the UK, Warner has a fair bit of business, so whether that has a huge amount of impact on some of that. I shouldn't imagine the indies that Warner's owns will have this, but certainly on the corporate side, and it's just pointing to how things are going to go. And similarly, you saw it with NBC Universal. They did something similar last week. Good news, bad news for Brits in Hollywood. On the one hand, you had Paul Telegdi, who the former BBC Worldwide man. He was chairman of NBC Entertainment. I mean, he's essentially in charge of commissioning for the main NBC channel, the director of content there, as it were. He's going. I mean, that's a bit of a tough one for him. He's had a bit of a bad week coming after he became the subject of a internal investigation into allegations of professional misconduct. So I don't think it was a huge surprise, but this was part of the restructure. And then another Brit, Frances Berwick, who back in the 90s used to work in Channel 4. She's got a bigger role. She used to be in charge of the cable networks, the lifestyle cable networks, and now she's essentially going to be in charge of all of the networks. But on the business side, they'll have a new programming boss. There's a lot of names being thrown around now in terms of who might get that job. But again, I think it points to this idea. You've seen that with Disney. You've seen what they've been doing. You've seen with some of the other studios. They're consolidating as we all essentially watch telly on the internet.
And I guess it's just a case of perhaps these huge companies were maybe planning on doing this and rationalizing their businesses over the next sort of 12, 18 months or so. But maybe COVID has really sort of brought it forward and just sped up the process.
Yeah, it's tough to tell, isn't it? You don't know how much of this would have happened or the timing of this. With Warner Media, I think Jason Kilar, who came in, I have a feeling this is not really COVID related. I think this is his plan. He joined a few months ago. So I imagine this is sort of his first thing that he's taken charge of. And then on the NBC Universal side, yeah, similarly, I'm not entirely sure that it's COVID related. As you say there, I think the timing of these things might have been impacted because a lot of the business is stalled at the moment. I mean, on both sides, other than the production shutdown, they both got these new streaming services. So I think that's really where this is with Peacock and HBO Max. So they're under the cover of COVID, but not a great time to lose your job either.
No, absolutely not. And is there any sense of how HBO Max has started out of the blocks?
Not really. None of these companies give numbers. They have admitted they haven't had a programming hit, as it were. I think Love Life was their big show, which was Anna Kendrick, and I'm sure Friends is doing well for them. But no, there's not a huge idea in terms of how they're going. And similarly, Peacock on the NBC side, they were both coming at a little bit late, so I think it's going to take them a little bit longer. But it's all about the shows, right? If they get a hit, if someone finds the next Game of Thrones, then this will be the biggest service. And if they don't, it'll rely on library and probably do relatively well anyway.
Well, we obviously wish anybody who's been impacted by this, both on the NBC Universal side and the Warner Media side, wish them all the best, and hopefully they can find new roles very quickly. I mean, there's obviously a lot of senior people now out on the market, so I'll be interested to see where they land.
Yeah, exactly. The dominoes falling does tend to shake things up. So I'm sure there will be some more moves over the coming weeks and months.
Okay, Peter, as always, thank you. Don't get caught in any of the earthquakes or any of the natural disasters.
I'll do my best. Thanks, Justin.
So it's that time in the show that we get to go over to Riga and speak to Girts Licis from K7 Media. Good day, Girts.
Hello, Justin. It's the Great Bake-Off Day, I think in London, but also in Riga. It's really hot.
As an Englishman, I'm suffering rather from this.
Are you?
Yeah, I mean, we're a country, as you probably know, that doesn't really understand air conditioning. So we're suffering. And obviously, everybody's at home. The whole TV industry's at home. Everyone's absolutely baking. What are we going to be talking about this week, Girts?
Well, today I thought I would focus in a bit more detail on the subject of a show with a purpose. Because as you may recall, I came up with this idea of drama with a purpose here on our podcast a couple of weeks ago. So I thought I should expand a little bit on this.
Okay.
Particularly when looking back at how the format industry developed over the decades. At its beginnings, formats were very much about bringing individual satisfaction to its participants. Whether it's about winning prizes or just money in a game show or remodeling someone's home or turning around a business, it was predominantly bringing some material good to the participants. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire became the quintessence of this trend, of course, and it is still the format of the formats, in my opinion. It arrived promising a life-changing amount of money. And it has changed quite a few lives since, no doubt about that. But what I'm saying is that it took a long way, almost 20 more years, to reach the stage when we start seeing what is really life-changing from a broader perspective. The next, shall I say, tier or a layer of formats brought in the feel-good element. It was no more always focused on direct materialistic values. Like maybe you could be helped out in finding a long-lost relative, or given the opportunity to show your talent performing in front of the queen, or perhaps marry at first sight. But it was still something important to pretty much only those directly involved. And then I think it was 2018, which truly became the year of turning people's mindset towards becoming more conscious about the world surrounding us and its long-term sustainability, the issues that are concerning the whole society, or at least a growing part of it. And when the focus of purposes started to shift from something that primarily affected us as individuals, adding the helicopter view purpose wider angle. While eating well for less is still going to make each of us as individuals healthier and save a penny, it is also now making us consider saving resources on production of trashy foods, for instance. And while watching a 4-year-old clinging to an elderly lady hugging her dearly is still going to bring us as adults down our own memory lanes, it also makes us think about what can we all do together to fight loneliness and extend the span of quality life in an aging society, like the Old People's Home for 4-year-olds was trying to do.
So this is like factual with a purpose, if you like.
Correct, to a certain extent, because notably what is also shifting, while initially the shows with a purpose were falling into the strictly factual category, the tone of the programming with purpose has been increasingly becoming lighter to reach broader audiences, including those which come to watch TV primarily for entertainment. If we imagine an axis stretching from strictly factual to strictly entertaining, the added value of programming with purpose is constantly moving towards the more entertaining end. From economic travel shows with only 5 items in a bag, to family reality with game show elements consisting of quiz on environmental issues, to growing unpopularity of talent show spin-offs featuring senior citizens, and so on. Even the classic formats like The Millionaire are stretching and adjusting where they can. For instance, by increasing their focus on strong storytelling, the stories behind its participants, who as individuals can provide their input in bringing up broader social issues which relate to the audiences. Like when it comes to diversity, for instance. There has been a mother with low income playing on the show in UK who came to afford to celebrate her son's 18th birthday, or in Turkey, where a mentally disabled individual was playing and therefore was provided with a whiteboard to write the answers on instead. Such encouragement to many people who may have watched thinking, what a good show, but I could never have a chance to be part of it. So answering your question, there is definitely a place for factual with a purpose, but there is certainly also entertainment with a purpose, as well as anything in between. And increasingly, to some extent, we have actually arrived back at the beginnings when the money mattered, only with a different reason. We see celebrities increasingly participating or playing a game for a chance to donate to a chosen charity, for instance. Or like in the current production of the Family Feud in Australia, which in light of COVID is going to be a special primetime television event consisting of a 10-episode run dedicated to celebrating frontline, emergency and healthcare workers and offering them the opportunity to win a serious money prize. Though in other cases, it's not the money that matters, but rather the feeling of we are all in this together, which is the case of an upcoming Belgian reality show in which celebrities are going to be trained to become nurses and will try out by themselves what do these long, tiring shifts mean. The fact that another Belgian format, Emergency Call, which immerses viewers into the world of the super demanding job of call takers of the emergency call center, became the second most sold format last year, with 10 sales, less only than the entertainment phenomenon The Masked Singer, shows that there is undoubtedly a growing appetite among audiences globally towards this kind of programming.
And actually, why do you see that trend increasing? What do you think the reason for that is?
I think it's just like a snowball which has started rolling and then just adding the snow on keeping rolling. Like we all know Greta from Sweden and so on, and particularly with younger audiences and younger people in general, not just audiences, becoming more conscious about the world around them. I think that's one of the biggest reasons.
So coming back to where you mentioned about drama with a purpose for the first time here a few weeks ago, tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, talking about scripted shows, we are definitely starting to see this same trend growing, with shows which have an objective not just to entertain, but to bring a broader issue to public awareness. In some cases, even in collaboration with a related authoritative body or with a consultant involved in that specific subject attached. Like the Spanish drama Los Desaparecidos, The Disappeared, featuring a group of 6 police officers within the national police responsible for investigating of missing person cases, trying to solve disappearance cases that everyone else has already given up on. This series is made in cooperation with the Spanish Missing Persons Association, which in its turn is run by a lady who is mother to a missing child herself. Hulu in the US is currently developing an adaptation of a bestseller book, which is a factual account of America's opioid crisis. Centering on a compassionate old-school doctor played by Michael Keaton, this drama called Dopesick will explore the struggles of addiction at various levels and will shine a light both on affected families and those fighting to cure the nation's drug problem. Disney's ABC, in its turn, is in works of yet untitled medical drama from The Good Doctor writer-producer David Renault, inspired by his own life. Renault was paralyzed in a car accident. Before taking a career change to be a writer, was inspired by his disability to attend medical school and attempt to be a doctor. This show is adapted to a female protagonist and will follow a female wheelchair-bound doctor, sending a strong message to all the skeptics. And finally, particularly strongly resonating with the recent Black Lives Matter movement, the former National Football League's quarterback Colin Kaepernick, renowned for taking the knee in protest to police brutality in 2016, has teamed up with filmmaker Ava DuVernay for new Netflix limited series Colin in Black and White, which will follow a young Kaepernick adopted as a baby by a white family through his teenage years and early rise to sporting stardom, exploring the events and circumstances that molded the future activist's social conscience.
So we're really seeing a flight to authenticity, aren't we, in both factual and scripted programming?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's just going to become bigger in the next year or so.
Yeah. And I guess you could say that many of the David Attenborough natural history documentaries maybe was responsible for some of this movement, or certainly kickstarting it with Blue Planet and the activism that came out of the back of the first show.
Possibly as one of the causes, but also if we are looking at the broader picture, I think the borders between scripted and unscripted in general have been becoming more and more blurry. And it's not just the scripted that's borrowing from the unscripted. It's also unscripted shows which are borrowing a lot of tools and tone from the scripted ones.
Yeah, well, in the UK, the BBC recently aired a 3-part factual series looking at the rise of the Murdochs, called Rise of the Murdochs. And the whole production and the feel, the theme tune was really, very much focused on Succession. So it was really interesting to see the drama inspiring a factual series rather than the other way around. Fascinating stuff. Girts, thank you very much as always. We'll see you next week.
Yeah, take care.
Well, that's about it for another week's show. As always, thanks for listening. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to the show and share it with friends and colleagues on social media. If you want to hear more about our advertising and sponsorship packages, including our new series of bespoke MIPCOM Slate podcasts, please email me at justin@boomdialogue.com. That's justin@boomdialogue.com. TellyCast was edited by Ian Chambers. On next week's show, we have Toby Faulkner, head of Unscripted at Facebook, along with Sam Barcroft, CEO of Barcroft Studios. So it's all about social media, digital and short form content. So don't forget to tune in then. Until then, look after yourselves and stay safe.